to the Rylands Lunchtime Seminar Series. My name is Stefan Hans from the John Rylands Research Institute and Library at the University of Manchester, and I'll be chairing the session today. The Rylands Lunchtime Seminar Series highlights the breadth and the quality of our unique special collections and showcases world-class collections-based research activities. Today's session is coming to you from various rooms in the historic John Rylands Library, and as usual, we will be showcasing some of the really outstanding artifacts of our collections and presenting new research on them. Our seminar today is entitled The Making of the Cranach Workshop's Copy of the Armorial of Bianca Maria Sforza, Rylands German MS 2. And before I'm going to introduce our speakers today, there are just a few things worth mentioning. As always, this event is being recorded, it will be edited, and it will be made available on the John Rylands Library YouTube channel. Auto subtitles are available using your own settings, and we are using Zoom webinar format. So this means that your camera and your microphone is disabled on entry. At the end of the session, there will be around 15 minutes for questions. So if you would like to ask one, please can you add questions to the Q&A function. These will be then selected by me as the chair, and I will convey them to the panel. And we should have time to take a few questions. So we are aiming to stop around 1:45 p.m. Without further preamble, I would like to introduce our presenters today. We'll be joined by Dr. Benjamin Pope, who is currently a fixed-term lecturer in medieval European history at the University of Manchester, and who was until January 2024 a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the John Rylands Research Institute. His research focuses on collective identities and relations between urban and rural elites in late medieval German-speaking Europe. Among his publications are Nuremberg's Noble Servant, Werner von Pausberg, Between Town and Nobility in Late Medieval Germany, published in OUP's German History, and Ben's Identification of German MS2 as a product of the Cranach's workshop was published in the Bulletin of the John Rylands Library in 2018, and it has received major interest by the media. Presenting with Ben is Tony Richards, senior photographer at the John Rylands Research Institute and Library and the lead photographer on advanced imaging techniques. The Rylands Imaging Lab does really groundbreaking, innovative work in our collection, so it is a huge joy to welcome both of you. Thank you both for talking to us today, and over to you.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So, yes, if we could have a quick look, Kerry, please, at the book here just in front of me. So what I wanted to show everyone to start with is this very close-up image of the helms at the head of the Saxon electoral arms, and we'll see the full coat of arms very shortly. But what I really wanted us to be able to start with is to appreciate the sheer detail of the painting of this coat of arms. And indeed, we can see here the golden hatching on the visors of the helms, also on some of the headgear as well above them. So this is a piece of artwork of the highest quality and something into which a huge amount of effort has been put. And we will see why in just a few minutes. So if we could go to the presentation, please. So yeah, so the seminar today is the making of the Cranach Workshop's copy of the Armorial of Bianca Maria Sforza. This is Rylands German manuscript 2, which is what we have with us here today on the visualizer. And so we'll be able to see some of the pages from it a little later. I think we're just getting the slides sorted. Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so could you have the first slide, please? Thank you. Here we go. So we begin then on the 22nd of June, 1565, when August of Saxony, Elector August of Saxony, commissioned what he requested as a true copy of an old armorial from the Cranach workshop in Wittenberg in order to clear up some confusion regarding his dynastic heraldry. We don't know exactly what this confusion was, but there were certainly a number of controversies and ambiguities surrounding the Wettin or Saxon heraldry and associated claims to territories and titles, not least given the division of the Wettin dynasty into Albertine and Ernestine branches and the contest between them for the electoral dignity. So Lucas Cranach the Younger initially sent the original armorial to August, but indicated that he couldn't manage without it for very long. And so August again requested a copy on the 3rd of July, 1565. August also commented that the armorial looks as though it had been well used. It seems that it was probably used as reference material in the Cranach workshop. And we see here Lucas Cranach the Younger's portrait of August from around 1572. And there were very long-standing connections, of course, between the Cranach family, both Lucas the Elder and Lucas the Younger, and the Wettin dynasty, both the Albertine and the Ernestine branches of it. Could you have the next slide, please? As I said before, what we have here is Rylands German MS 2. And how do we know that this armorial that was commissioned by August is the manuscript that we have with us today? And this identification was the outcome of a research project that I undertook between 2017 and 2018. And I think a key piece of evidence is the binding, which is dated 1565 and has the initials PT, which almost certainly stands for Paul Thiele, who was active in Wittenberg between the 1550s and 1575. The watermark throughout the entire manuscript is the Saxon electoral arms, although that's not necessarily clinching evidence. But what we certainly see throughout the entire manuscript is that it corresponds to August's instructions, which he set out in letters of the 3rd and 14th of July, 1565, in terms of the paper size, the layout of the coats of arms, the method by which they should be created, namely with stencils using a variety of shield forms, and the blank pages that were to be left for later editions. He also asked that it should be labelled in a Fraktur script, and all of these can be seen today in Rylands German 2. We also see, as we saw at the beginning and we see now on the slide, the extremely detailed Saxon electoral arms. And this coat of arms is followed by a very long section of lesser nobles who were, according to the presentation in this armorial, subordinated to the electors of Saxony. We can also see plenty of stylistic parallels with heraldry in woodcuts from the Cranach workshop as well. So I'm certainly very confident in this identification of the manuscript as the Cranach armorial that's mentioned in the correspondence that we have today in the State Archive in Dresden. We can also, of course, say a lot about what the old armorial must have been. This manuscript is now lost, or certainly its whereabouts isn't known. But we can say, I think quite conclusively from looking at this copy by Cranach, that it was associated with the Empress Bianca Maria Sforza, the second wife of the Emperor Maximilian I, partly because her coat of arms, as we see on the slide here, is the first coat of arms in the current manuscript, but also because these arms are followed by the arms of 39 princely ladies who were all living around 1500. This collection of aristocratic female coats of arms is almost unique in German armorials. And so it's clearly been introduced here to emphasize the importance of Bianca Maria Sforza. Clearly her coat of arms is not at the front by accident. It is meant to be the major focus of this manuscript. There are also many other Habsburg connections, including a motto associated with the Emperor Frederick III, which, well, in fact, there are two mottos to be strict about it, and one is a variation of his famous AEIOU device, which was resolved in various ways. In this case, it's a Latin phrase which translates as the elected eagle justly vanquishes all. But we also have another phrase which translates as what cannot be undone is best forgotten, which is more of a private motto of Frederick's. And so that also helps to place the armorial very closely in the immediate familial sphere of the Habsburg ruling dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire. But we can also place it in the context of late medieval German armorial production, in particular, a tradition that's often known as the late Constance or Bodensee tradition. And the characteristics of this tradition of armorials include the appearance of various Upper German noble associations, societies with names like the Fish and the Falcon, the Crown, the Wolf, which we might come to a bit later, and also a way of describing the Holy Roman Empire known as the Quaternionen, and these are sets of 4 holders of different ranks and titles within the empire, ranging from the 4 pillars of the empire to the 4 villages, indeed the 4 peasants of the empire also appear. So all of that places it quite clearly in its, the old armorial, quite clearly in its political and artistic context. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no. Okay, can we have the next one, please? Yeah. Okay, so other coats of arms have been added later, however, to the old armorial that was copied by Cranach. And at what stage these were added, we don't know, of course. If it was being used as reference material in the workshop, they may have been slipped in at any point in time and then copied into the version that we see today. So we have coats of arms that have more than 4 fields, so coats of arms that are more than quartered arms. These were only really developed after 1500. And so we see on the image here is the coats of arms of Anhalt, and we see that's got 9 fields. And this was a coat of arms really that only comes into use from about 1540, but we also see a very similar version in woodcuts by the Cranach workshop as well. Also cropping up occasionally in this copy are some individuals who lived or reigned after 1500, who must have been added later. And we also know that August himself asked for the coats of arms to be made larger and for new arms to be added, if any were known. And of course, this may be how we arrived at such a very large section of Saxon nobles. Next slide, please. So there are many questions, of course, about the process of copying this armorial. Firstly, how long did it take? Because we know that only 2 quires had definitely been completed by the 12th of December, 1565, when Elector August wrote to Cranach asking for the work to be expedited, essentially. And we know that those 2 quires were sent to August, but how long the rest took and whether the rest was produced in the same campaign, as it were, is not entirely clear. Precisely what content was added? Was any of the original content reordered? And did changes to the layout and or order of the coats of arms change the relationship between the princes and the lesser nobles that's depicted here in the manuscript? Certainly August's copy that we have today conveys the strong impression of lesser nobles clearly subordinated to princes in clearly defined territories. But the reality was, of course, much less clear-cut, and it was all the less so in around about 1500. Also, how does this armorial relate to other projects in the Cranach workshop? August specifically asked that it should be produced by Cranach's apprentices, and so we wonder how it was prioritized, how did its production interact with other commissions that were in progress at the same time. Next slide, please. So this is just to show the sample quires that we know were sent to August in December 1565. And on the 12th of December, August thanked Cranach for sending these and informed him that he had retained these sheets, these quires that we see here, which show the coats of arms of the territories that comprised his principality. And he told Cranach then to complete the rest of the armorial, have it bound, and send it to him together with the notification of the cost. But unfortunately, no further correspondence survives to help us know when this work was completed. And what you can see here, of course, is the two quires showing the full page layout of the princely arms on the first page, followed by the counties and territories, depicted 5 to a page, and that's followed in the rest of the Saxon section by the lesser nobles that are depicted 9 to a page. And the second quire, on the second quire, we can see the stencils that haven't yet been filled in, and of course the blank pages left for additions in case, as August would have hoped, of course, that extra territories were added to the Wettin dynastic lands. And what's particularly relevant here as well is that page number 101, the large electoral Saxon coat of arms, has been imaged using multispectral imaging. And so we can compare this part of the sample quire with other parts of the manuscript. But before we go on to that, I just note in the next slide, please, that you can read more about all of this in my article that Stefan mentioned at the beginning. And also another story that's associated with this manuscript is the Arabic inscription on the flyleaf, which colleague Jake Benson and I have written about in a blog post. And you can see the whole manuscript online as well, fully digitized. The image here is the coat of arms of the nobles of good beer, with what looks like a perfect Guinness in the shield. And this was presumably added later as a joke. And the difference in pigments between this coat of arms and the others in the manuscript is obvious to the naked eye. But clearly, what Tony is going to show us now is a much more sophisticated analysis of the pigments in the manuscript. So over to Tony.
Thank you, Ben. I'm just going to share my screen. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm up in one of the imaging studios at the John Rylands. Let me just share my screen with you. And if someone can let me know that they can see my screen and not my notes. And we can assume that's the case. Okay, everyone, as Ben mentioned, we've been using some multispectral imaging to look at German MS2. First of all, a bit of explanation about multispectral imaging. So multispectral imaging, as the screen says here, captures light from a range of wavelengths. So some that are visible and some that are invisible to the human eye. And that's across the whole of the electromagnetic spectrum, using specialist cameras, light sources, and filters. We usually use this for investigating faded and erased texts, but we can also use it to analyze and identify certain pigments and materials. We currently use a phase 1 rainbow system, which is similar to our standard photography systems, but the data we're looking at the moment was taken in 2018 with a previous system. On the screen, you can see, actually just by chance, is German MS2 beneath the wavelength-specific LED light panels. These emit UV light from about 365 nanometers through 940 nanometers, which is near infrared. This little clip is not in real time. A full stack of images at present takes about 4 minutes to capture. So Ben had asked if I could look at the MSI data of German MS2, possibly identifying pigments on certain pages, and if those pigments matched each other. Here are the pages in question, and can we compare the pigments? Well, yes. Can we identify them? Maybe. bearing in mind that there are some limitations to multispectral systems and how they can be used. So we aren't looking at faded text, but we're looking at basic pigment identification. Here's an example from a previous research project. Uses proof of concept to identify lapis lazuli in Latin MS30. Here we have known blue pigment samples laid down by our collection team. You can see it on the left of your screen. These have been imaged with multispectral imaging and the reflectance curves plotted onto a graph. That's showing the amount of reflectance along the electromagnetic spectrum for each sampled area. So as the lights change, it's measuring the reflectance. And you can see here that the samples of the blue pigments all have a signature curve on the graph. Now let's take a look at the same process, but sampling the blues from the pages of Latin MS30. Here you can see the comparison results on the screen. The graph shows the spectral curves, and those plotted in yellow and pink are almost identical. You can just make them out as slightly different in certain areas around the 700 nanometer area. Those are the curves from the sample data from the blue areas of the MS and the data from the lapis lazuli light sample. So the blue pigment from Latin MS30 is comparable in response to lapis lazuli, a very expensive pigment to use throughout the manuscript. Remember, this is just measuring the intensity of light bouncing off the page. So from the page, the light hits it and bounces back into the camera sensor. It's basically using MSI data as a photospectrometer. So let's go back to German MS2. Here are the pigment curves for red, blue, green, and yellow of page 101. You can see again, each has its own signature curve or shape. Multiple areas are sampled. We don't just pick one little area of blue or green, and screen grabs are recorded, so we have reference images for all areas that are sampled. So here are red, blue, green, and yellow pigments of each page, just for comparison. And of course, two of the pages don't actually have any green pigments. And here are the grouped pigment types from each page, just for comparison. You can see they have the same shape, but differing intensities, but close enough to say they are possibly the same pigment. I say possibly. Although the green pigments of page 20 and 101 do have slight noticeable differences in the blue end of the spectrum. So how do we compare the pigments? We do have a limited pigment library database of known samples kindly provided by our collection care team. And these have been run through the MSI system and plotted into this table. It is a limited pigment library, but it is of commonly used pigments. This screen shows the data for our known red pigments. And this is the results of the red pigments according to our database, plotted as a graph. The reds from German MS2 being identified as vermilion deep genuine. That's the name of the comparison pigment used by collection care team. Vermilion has been used from antiquity up to the 19th century, made from a powdered mineral cinnabar, a form of mercury sulfide. Unfortunately, that's not conclusive evidence alone, as there are other conflicting results depending on the areas sampled and the density of the pigments. So some red samples showed as vermilion and others as red ochre. This was, oops, we go back a slide. Where was I? Reds, yes. So the reds, the blues were azurite, a well-known pigment from a copper mineral, but they were also at certain areas it's sampled as blue verditer, but that originates in the 17th century and not the 16th century. As for the yellows, yellow ochre, a mixture of iron minerals that has been in use since prehistoric times, or it could have been lead tin yellow, the yellow of the old masters. And that's a pigment used from 1300 through to 1750 and apparently rediscovered in 1941. So we have conflicting evidence already. And as for those problematic green pigments that are only on the 2 pages sampled, one might expect verdigris or malachite. But these results came back as chromium oxide, also known was known as viridian, and that was first prepared in 1838. And it also came back as cadmium green, made popular by the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists painters in the late 19th century. So I'm not a pigment expert. So these results raise far more questions for the researcher and require further investigation. So what do we do next? Due to these mixed results, we can look for other tools and methods that will give us a more precise answer to Ben's questions. This involves collaboration and expertise from other professionals. This might include FORS, fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, or Raman spectroscopy. Now, we've worked closely in the past with Team Pigment, who were formed in 2013 and are based at Durham University. Professors Beebe and Gameson and Dr. Nicholson have been very helpful with additional analysis in the past. Luckily for us, they will be visiting again in 2 weeks' time for analysis on a different collection item. So I've taken the liberty or the opportunity to request further investigation of the pages of German MS2 whilst they are visiting. I suppose this serves as a reminder that MSI or multispectral imaging is not the magical technological instrument often portrayed within the heritage sector, and it's just one tool that we have access to. This could also support the argument for the need to acquire our own XRF, Raman, or FORS system in the future. So watch this space and check back for those results very soon. Thank you. And I'll stop my screen. There we go. Thank you. Back to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, Tony. What an amazing manuscript, what a stunning discovery, and what an exciting imaging work that is happening with it, pointing towards further collaboration in the future. Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. This is the moment where I invite everybody to make use of the Q&A in the Q&A function, and you can post your questions there, and then I'm going to convey them to the audience. What I wanted to ask at the very beginning, well, there are many questions about the pigments, but maybe I start with a question for Ben regarding the prominence of the coats of arms of aristocratic women in the collections. You mentioned that this was to emphasize the importance of Bianca Maria Sforza, but is there also something to be said about the context of women at the court in Saxony for whom the copy was produced, and whether the prominence of these particular coats of arms was making this copy and this manuscript so appealing for the Saxonian context with Anne of Denmark there?
Yes, thank you, Stefan. That's a very interesting question. I've been thinking about these coats of arms mainly in the context of Bianca Maria Sforza and her particular position around about 1500, which was very difficult for her because her family in Milan had been driven out by the French, of course, around that time. And so she needed to potentially situate herself in the empire more clearly. And so what I think this section of the Armorial serves to do is to place her in a kind of empire of women, if you like, in the Holy Roman Empire, and places her obviously at the top of this hierarchy. And actually, if you can switch the visualizer quickly, then we can just see some of these coats of arms that I'm talking about. It's not zooming out very well, but oh yeah, that works better. Yeah, so this is one of the openings that we're talking about here. I'll just move that a little bit, maybe this way. Yes, like that. Yeah, there we go. So yes, you can see this is a beautifully illustrated coats of arms that show the arms of the women as a combination, of course, of their fathers and their husbands' arms. And I think it does say a lot about the relationship between women and heraldry more generally within the empire, because we know that aristocratic women played a very important symbolic role in the attribution of male honor, essentially, through admission to tournaments. And this was done through an institution known as the Halmschau, or the Show of Halms, in which the ladies who were present at the tournament would go round the night before and identify the coats of arms and the halms of the male tournament participants, and reject any that they thought weren't fit to take part in the tournament. And sometimes we have descriptions of these coats of arms then being thrown out of the hall that they were displayed in, dragged through the mud, etc. And so, at least symbolically, it was very important that aristocratic women could read and interpret this heraldry so that they could perform this function of mediating male honor. And so an armorial like this is something that we, in that sense, we could expect any aristocratic woman, whether at the Habsburg court or the Saxon court, to be associated with. And in that sense, it's perhaps surprising that we don't have more armorials that are clearly associated with women. Those that I'm aware of certainly are from the Habsburg context. And so that is an area that I certainly want to develop and try to do more work on, because I think there's a lot that we can learn here about the relationship between women and heraldry, and more widely about the way in which patriarchal chivalric society sometimes pretends or play acts as a matriarchy, which I think is very significant. So that's a little bit about the broader context, but yes, I'll look into the Saxon context in more detail as well.
Thank you so much, Ben. Very important contextualization in terms of gender and the manuscripts that we have here. Tony, you were stressing very much the possibilities, but also the limits of specific scientific approaches, and that's obviously very, very important. Still, based on the findings that we have with the imaging analysis that you have produced, what do you think do the findings tell us about the production of the armorial? So do the consistency of findings, for instance, hint at a continuous production, or is it possible to speak about later additions? Are there some findings already now?
Good question. I think from the results you can say that the pigments used are similar or identical to the pages that Ben were interested in. As for what those pigments are, I think that's less accurate just because of the system that we use, plus the pigments being mixed on the page. So we tend to try to sample quite dense areas of pigments of just one pigment, which you can identify through the different wavelengths. But in these samples, it was quite difficult. So I think that's why we've got the differing results. And not being a pigment specialist at all, I couldn't comment on if this has been touched up at a later date or what. That's down to Ben and his research. I can just provide the data.
I mean, for the lead, you mentioned the lead tin yellow. For this, you would need XRF, but then there are the blue tins like azurite and ultramarine pigments that would respond to near infrared.
Yeah, so we could use to have an accurate result, we need equipment like fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy or Raman spectroscopy. That will give us a definitive answer.
Ben, from the results that you've seen, is there anything that has surprised you that you did not expect in terms of findings?
Not greatly, no. Although it is significant that that Tony's been able to identify that the pigments are the same across parts of the manuscript that we know that were produced at least slightly different times. That is very helpful for understanding the production, and that's what you'd expect from the naked eye as well. But it's really helpful to have that confirmation with the technology. Obviously, in terms of identifying the pigments themselves, that would be extremely helpful. And then we could maybe compare it with other works from the Cranach workshop as well. That would be very exciting.
Thank you very much. Is there an overlap with the pigments that have been used for the manuscript illustration with other kind of pigment practices in terms of painting in the workshop? Is there anything you know already about that, or is that something you want to look into still?
Yes, I think that's something we have to look into, and especially if we can get access to the other analytical techniques that Tony's mentioned, we could go into that in more detail, I think. But also, as far as I'm aware, most of the research on the Cranach workshop, of course, is concerned the Alder Cranach, and of course the paintings of the Alder Cranach, and a product of the workshop like this hasn't attracted so much attention. So there's a lot of potential here, I think, to shed light on how the workshop was operating more generally. But I think, as Tony says, we need the more, or the other types of analysis as well.
There has been also a question, I mean, just to remind everybody, for the questions, it would be best to use the Q&A function and to type it in there, and I'm then going to read them out. There has been a question about the 19th century rediscovery and of pigments that Tony mentioned earlier. So how common was it in the 19th century to touch up illustrations with new pigments then?
That a question
Do we
for me,
know that? I think it's a question for Tony.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't have an answer for that one, Stefan. That was quite a flippant remark by myself, I suppose.
Okay.
But if those specific pigments date from that era, and they are later identified to be those pigments, it does raise the question: why are they on there? So we need accurate pigment identification first before we can suggest they've been touched up, I suppose.
And you said you would seek for collaborations in terms of XRF force and Raman spectroscopy. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So in the next couple of weeks, we hope that will happen.
Right. There has been a broader question about heraldic knowledge management in the Wittenberg, in the Cranach workshop, which I'd pass on as to Ben. It's a very broad question, but perhaps you can say a bit more about this in general. Do you know more about how heraldic knowledge was managed in this context, in the workshop context?
I think what we can say from this manuscript is that clearly the workshop was aware of what it had produced before, which is not necessarily a trivial finding, because the copies of the coats of many of the coats of arms here are almost certainly derived from, and certainly very closely parallel, the woodcuts and so on that were produced at an earlier date. And so the workshop clearly is, I think, quite clearly building up a bank of reference material on heraldry and so on, and particularly in the heraldry that's going to be useful for various commissions that they produce. So obviously the Saxon heraldry in the first instance, but also what we see in the manuscript is other heraldry from northern and central Germany. So for instance, Hessen, Pommern, Mecklenburg, those are the coats of arms that have been, in inverted commas, updated in this copy. And those are the coats of arms that the Cranach workshop would have been working with in their other commissions as well, and that we can see in other works from the Cranach workshop. And so what we see here, I think, is the sort of the heraldic memory of the workshop that's been preserved in this copy, or as it were, a kind of momentary image of it has been taken in this copy. What this copy also includes, of course, is a huge amount of heraldry that was probably of no interest to the workshop. And of course, we have no idea how the Cranach workshop ended up with this armorial that was, I think, almost certainly originally created for Bianca Maria Sforza. So it's a fascinating window, I think, into the workshop. But as I say, a better understanding of the production process would help us to understand that.
I think as a follow-up specification for that question, can you say a bit more about the extent to which the Cranach workshop or those commissioning such a manuscript would be free or bound in what they could do with such an existing repertoire with such an existing heraldic repertoire? Also, the kind of layout of the manuscript, is it hierarchical? How's it organized?
Yes, I think what we see is quite a lot of freedom, actually, in the way that certain aspects of the armorial tradition are treated in this copy. And obviously, there's a question as to what extent that reflects the original old armorial as well. So some things are quite closely paralleling another armorial from the same tradition known as Grünenberg, named after a patrician from the city of Constance. Other elements are diverging from it quite considerably. And the divergences are often related to the way in which the lesser nobles, whose arms are depicted, interact with the greater princes of the empire. And so I might just look for an example quickly of how the coats of in particular, the noble societies of Upper Germany, which are very, very prominent in the Grünenberg armorial, have been reduced in prominence here. And so what we can see in this image is, yes, we can see on the left-hand page, we can see a sort of a fish and a bird there in half gold and half silver towards the top of the page. And then just below them, there's this, again, this half gold, half silver dog on a leash with a sort of a wreath attached to it as well. So these are two German noble societies, sometimes called tournament societies. The terminology is controversial, of course, but and these are the silver and gold insignia indicate that both knights and squires were part of these societies. And these two societies would have formed, or did form, whole sections by themselves in the Grünenberg armorial, but here they've been transformed into just insignia next to the coats of arms of prominent members of those societies. And so their importance has been substantially reduced. And instead, rather than the societies forming the sections of the armorial, we see them instead appearing as simply a part of the what we could call the Swabian section, but the Swabian section here is subordinated to the coats of arms of what was at this stage the Duchy of Wittenberg. And so there appears to have been an effort to subordinate the lesser nobility to the Dukes of Wittenberg, which is also quite interesting in the Habsburg context, because of course the Habsburgs and the Wittenbergs were rivals for power in southwest Germany. So it's very interesting to think about what's going on there and how the armorial tradition that we can see in something like Grünenberg has been transformed within this armorial. But of course, at the same time, there's always the caveat that we have to be thinking about how that might have changed between the armorial of Bianca Maria Sforza and the copy that we see today.
Thank you very much. That is a great picture to end this presentation with. I'm aware of the time. I'd like to thank both Ben and Tony again for a really fantastic presentation. And I'd also like to thank everybody here for your audience questions and the comments that we've received. And of course, massive thanks to our tech team who have been running this for us off camera as well. As you know, this has been the final seminar of the series for this semester, but no worries, we will be back with many more exciting talks in autumn. The program will circulate soon, so stay tuned and check the What's On page on the Rylands website, where you will find all relevant information. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you all again in autumn. And for now, have a nice summer.